Right, in which case, should we get straight into it?
Why not?
Lovely stuff. Right. Well, I'm going to, as I said to you before we started, I'm going to get into the bulk of the first half of the talk by talking about iridology, which of course is something that you're very well versed in as someone who's written multiple books. So, first of all, practical iridology, using your eyes to pinpoint your health risks and your particular path to well-being. As the writer of this book, what is iridology in plain English?
Well, it's actually the art and science, I would say, of making diagnostic pronouncements from looking at people's eyes. So it's the iris, of course, is what gives iridology or iridology its name, and the iris of the eye is the coloured part. And it's, when we think about people and describe each other to each other, for example, we usually say, oh, he's got fair hair and blue eyes, or he's got dark skin and dark eyes, etc. So the eyes become a sort of an identifier in our minds when we're talking about people anyway. But if you look very deeply into that structure, you can see microscopic things that you won't see with the naked eye that have been found to be consistent with certain types of health problems. Not as absolute predictors, but as suggestions of risk factors, if I can say that. So rather than talking about diagnosis in the way that doctors do it, you have a bunch of symptoms and they say you've got X, Y, Z, whatever the pathology or the disease that they're naming might be. We're saying you've got things that point to the fact that you might, for example, have a genetic history, a family history, that is, of certain issues. Things like diabetes come up quite often, things like heart problems come up quite often in that respect. But more than that, we're looking at the underlying causation of those problems. So we're looking at what has to go wrong before we actually get the disease. Now, I realise I've said quite a lot there. Is that simple enough?
I think...
Or does it need to be broken down?
Yeah, let's burrow into it, because if anyone's anything like me, then their brains aren't firing on the same wavelength as yours. I think the first thing that I'd like to go into with that is how you actually got into the field, because it's not something that is mainstream. Of course, the reason why I've had to get you to sort of break it down is for that very reason, because it's sort of a niche field. So how did you actually get into the study of the iris?
Yeah, I mean, it's a constitutional tale. I was at Cambridge University back in the 70s, and I still live in Cambridge, by the way. And I came out of university in a bit of a state, because I've been, like most students, doing things that probably I shouldn't have been doing, and pulling all-nighters to get my assignments in on time, etc., etc. Over-reliance on caffeine and tobacco, particularly.
Yeah, that's a familiar story.
And I was kind of looking for answers, and the GP wasn't giving them to me because I was just feeling rubbish. So a friend of mine pointed me in the direction of a practitioner who just started in the area, who was practicing herbal medicine, naturopathy, and iridology. And when I heard about it, I was immediately interested. I thought, well, let's check her out. So I went to see her. And long story short, she sort of turned around 3 years of rust in about 3 weeks, which I was very impressed by. In other words, I'd never felt better, really, after doing her program. And as part of that, she looked into my eyes and she told me a lot of things that I'd never even thought about, like whether my liver was working properly or whether my skin was discharging, properly through sweat, etc. And so I was sort of faced with a load of ideas about health that I'd never come across before, but which seemed intuitively helpful. And indeed, the results spoke for themselves. So at that point, having graduated in Cambridge with an arts degree, there were no jobs for people like me at the time. I was basically on the dole. But she suggested to me that it might be something that I could explore. And so I did. And that's where it all started.
So from that point in which it sounds like, as with many of the sort of most pleasant parts of our life, we stumble our way into something that becomes absolutely profound.
Yeah, absolutely. You sort of somehow end up where you're supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly
I'm
that.
not planning to go in that direction at all. I'm not science-based by inclination. I'm more of a sort of an arts-based. I'm a writer. I'm a musician. I've even done a degree in fine art. Over the course of my life. So this sort of approach to health, I would have generally left it to the doctors. But in my case, the sort of medical interventions were not really satisfying. They weren't really doing the trick. And so I think from that alone, I was sort of motivated to find other answers.
I suppose you could say, though, to what you've just said there about sort of that creative element of yourself, that's exactly what's sort of come out there, is you haven't been getting what you're wanting out of the sort of conventional methods, and as a result, you've sought out something new. You've created a new sort of way of tackling the issue for yourself.
Absolutely. And interestingly enough, we're going to be talking a little bit later about sort of personality as seen through the eyes. And if you were to look at my eyes and understand them through that lens, so to speak, you realise that that's almost predicted in my iris pattern as well.
Which I think is a very interesting segue into the thing that I thought was particularly interesting here, is I want us to go over sort of the physical and the mental sort of telling signs of the iris, because I think they're both equally interesting. But the next question that I put forth was, what can our eyes tell us about our inner world?
I sometimes get, I'm sort of musing a little bit on this one, because when I think about my inner world, I have to sort of make an accommodation for the fact that inside and outside, it's very difficult to separate them sometimes. One's perspective on reality is always going to be subjective. But I think that this is where the personality side of it comes in, because, I can be very introspective. If you talk about the term introvert, for example, introvert or extrovert, I can also be extroverted as well. So it's not a sort of hard and fast diagnosis or definition. But I think when it comes down to, the things that one might think about, one's approach to the world, what floats one's boat. Do you know what I mean? Those things that sort of impel us to doing the things we want to do, or perhaps inform our responses to the world, i.e. to stress, for example. One of the things that the iris is very good at is determining in what way we habitually respond to stress and problems and challenges in life, and that can be very different from one person to another, and guided by the sort of internal dialogue, I suppose, that you might have with yourself. So I think there's quite a lot on that level. Generally, we call that behavioural. There's a whole sort of, I would call it an application within iridology, which we call behavioural iridology, which I have studied, and I've imported it to some extent into what I do, and into my own system, which we'll talk about later with the second book, where we're really looking at the personality, the typical responses of a person, the way that they handle certain conflicts, for example, and the nature of those conflicts, where they come from, perhaps from our childhood or formative years, perhaps from somewhere else, I don't know. But the iris is a fairly reliable and fairly accurate representative of that kind of territory, the internal territory.
So why, in which case, I'm going to probe you in a way that might be somewhat controversial. Why do you think that this is such sort of borrowed information? This is not something that's put forth to the front of our intelligence. But of course, as you say, you speak of the fact that there's a great deal that we can sort of determine from the way that we look at our eyes. But of course, as I say, this stands still as a form of sort of niche practice. Why do you think that is?
I think there are a few questions in there. One is, how does iridology work in that respect, and what's the sort of, explanatory mechanism at the heart of it, which is certainly something I can go into. And the other is what's almost like, why hasn't hit the mainstream, for example, i.e. you call it niche, and I would agree it is niche. But why is it that it hasn't become more widely known and has become part of our cultural approach? And I think the answer to that is quite complex, and it goes into politics, actually. It goes into, I'll give you an example of that. For example, I think in 1941, the British, or not the British Medical Association, it was the General Medical Council. Up to that time, doctors were routinely using iridology. It was a medical skill. It had been taught in medical schools. In 1941, the GMC decided that they no longer wanted doctors to use iridology in their practice, not because it was considered outdated or antiquated or ineffective or wrong, but because, in their words, it is not considered desirable to give patients the means of self-diagnosis. In other words, they felt it was a slightly dangerous practice, that people, if they got wind of it, that they could look in their eyes and diagnose themselves, they might, actually come to some harm or diagnose themselves wrongly, or perhaps diagnose themselves correctly and not need doctors. Because actually, one of the things that comes, that comes into iridology is the idea of preventive healthcare. If you can see your risks ahead of time, you can take evasive action. And so, along with many other forms of what they call alternative and complementary medicine, I don't like those terms. I prefer to call it natural medicine or traditional medicine, actually. But in that kind of category, we are in a world at the moment that is down-regulating those techniques and those skills, and presenting contemporary standard medicine, biomedicine, as it's sometimes called, as the norm and the only valid medicine, scientific medicine, and anything else is sort of marginalized. We saw this very much during the pandemic. We saw, I was deplatformed 3 times for talking about herbal remedies for the immune system that would help us to resist the worst that COVID could do. And I was deplatformed not because I was giving people irresponsible advice. That was the sort of gloss that was put on it. I was deplatformed because they didn't want any alternative narratives to be put forward, because of the plan of the whole pandemic was working towards the vaccination program. And even the medics were hamstrung in that respect, because they were told not to use medicines that they had at their disposal, like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, for example. So it wasn't even just the alternatives that were sort of sidelined in that. And that tells you that there's a hell of a political charge connected with the way that the world deals with health. Most recently, of course, within the last few weeks, the World Health Organization has succeeded in passing their pandemic preparedness treaty, and 137 countries have signed up to it, which means basically that they're handing over the responsibility for dealing with a possible future pandemic to the WHO, to this centralized body, which, as we all know, is funded by people like the Gates Foundation. And you only have to look at pictures of Bill Gates, almost like, kind of waving syringes about to know what his agenda is. So I think that the iridology suffered a lot in those stakes, because, and they're always attempting to sort of say, well, there's no evidence for it. Interestingly, I can show you some really, really powerful evidence in favour of iridology, evidence that would pass muster in any scientific establishment, but it's not widely publicised, and in fact it's probably deliberately suppressed in many cases. But reputable universities have funded studies that have proved the effectiveness of iridology within certain very clearly defined parameters. So this is a case of, the reason why iridology is niche is because it's not been allowed to enter the mainstream. I think the most recent country to teach iridology to medical students is Russia, and they stopped in the year 2000, so not too long ago actually. But I know this because a couple of Russian doctors ended up in my classes because they could no longer get iridology teaching in Russia. So they came to the UK and they came to me. So, that's the answer to one part of your question, I think. The other part, what's the explanatory narrative, if you like, why do we think it works? I think the bulk of modern contemporary iridologists would agree that we're talking about genetics here. We're talking about a genetic footprint that the iris represents. So in other words, your DNA is your individual unique DNA is expressed throughout your body. It's expressed in every cell. It's expressed as the signature of DNA, but it's also expressed in the way your body develops, the look that you have, whether your hair, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes. And microscopically, if you look into the eyes, there's nobody on the planet with eyes that are identical to yours. They might be very similar, but they're not identical, and that can be demonstrated. And in fact, not so long ago, iridology was used as a bioidentifier for passport purposes and for access purposes. So we know that this is a highly individual structure, much more accurate, in fact, than fingerprints, about possibly up to 200 times more accurate than fingerprints in terms of bioidentification. So I think this is generally accepted as the way that iridology functions. And it's interesting, isn't it, that iridology is and has been accepted as a bioidentifier in certain circumstances for security purposes, passport control, etc., which is kind of interesting when you consider that they're at pains to point out to us that there's nothing really going on here, there's nothing to see here. Methinks they doth protest too much, to use the Shakespearean quote. If they're so keen to tell everybody that it doesn't work, why are they actually using it in other contexts?
Yes, it begs the question.